All right, it's time to look at Albert Einstein as an illustration of how tropical and sidereal zodiacs work in basic Vedic astrology. Now, before we jump into the astrology part of this, let's get on the same page about what we're actually doing and what we're not doing. So what we're doing here is debating the practical merits of two zodiacs, using Einstein as a case study. Now, what we're not doing, we're not going to be able to prove or disprove anything by doing this. Why not? Because astrology and birth charts are just too complicated, too complex, and the very issue of interpretation itself is too subjective. Then what's the point of it? The point of it is to show you how I would compare tropical and sidereal in a particular case study like Einstein. It's not even just the interpretation of the chart which is subjective. Even the comprehension of the person, the native, is so subjective. So with that in mind, the first thing I want to do in this video is establish some key points about who Einstein is. So of course, the thing that everybody knows is Einstein was a great scientist. What kind of scientist specifically? You could call him a Gyani. He was a philosophical mathematician. He's trying to find the one underlying principle that explains all of reality. Now, Einstein's nakshatras already go a huge mile to explaining this quality in him, because he's got the Ardra ascendant, which is well known to produce Gyanis, and he's got Uttara Bhadrapada for Mercury and Saturn, which is also well known to produce Gyanis. And he's even got the sun in Purva Bhadrapada, which is another Bhadrapada, which is associated with Gyanis, scientists. So that's the part that everybody knows, but let's also talk about some lesser known things that are extremely important about him. Einstein is what we would describe today as autistic. For example, he didn't speak at all until he was 3 years old, into his third year. Not a single word. And then all of a sudden, he starts speaking in completely formed sentences. Just in general, Einstein doesn't fit in, and that's one of the key things of autism, is just being in a different page, in a different world than everybody else. Another quality about him under this umbrella of autism that people are not very familiar with is that he didn't test very well at school. Grades weren't like through the roof or anything. Finally, as a child, he had no interest in socializing or playing with kids. He just wanted to read books or do complicated things. And as an adult, his relationships were quite troublesome, especially the romantic relationships. And finally, I want to speak a little bit more about the specific nature of his relationships. Einstein was obsessed with what he was doing and oblivious to everything else. This means that he was super insensitive and highly demanding. He had very specific needs. Now, he married somebody while he was in love with two other women. He had 3 children with this wife. The first child, we don't even know what happened to. Second child was fairly normal. Third child was like a super genius who then went crazy and got diagnosed as schizophrenic and committed to institutions. He was with this wife for 11 years. The last 7 of those 11 years, he was in an affair with one of those women that he loved. That woman that he loved was his first cousin. So he really didn't give a damn. So 7 of his 11 years of his marriage is an affair with somebody else. 5 of those, the last 5 of the years, he was living separately from his wife. Then finally, he divorces the wife, and then immediately, within, I think, 2 months, marries that cousin. But all the while complaining that he's forced to marry her and that marriage is a ridiculous thing. Even after marrying his cousin, he's cheating on her as well. He is even considering leaving his cousin to marry his cousin's eldest daughter from her first marriage. So these are things about Einstein that are super important. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get into his chart. Okay, first let's have a look at this autism. The sidereal chart, as you see, has got Gemini rising, and the tropical chart has got Cancer rising. So there's different rising signs here. Gemini is not very inclined to being antisocial, just the opposite. Gemini is very inclined to wanting to interact with people, whereas Cancer is very inclined to being antisocial and wanting to be private or different, withdrawn from people. The sidereal chart, however, will say, well, look, it's a Gemini rising, but look where the first lord is. the first lord Mercury is debilitated. So this guy's not going to be a typical Gemini rising. And it's with the eighth lord. So again, he's not going to be typical. He's going to actually have kind of opposite traits to Gemini because the first lord is debilitated. It's with the eighth lord Saturn. And on top of that, in the sidereal chart, the moon is debilitated too. So that explains your autism. He's got a debilitated first lord Mercury, a debilitated moon. That moon is in the sixth house, and it's in Kama Yoga. So you really couldn't get much worse. So this is a good interpretation. However, Einstein's particular type of autism was not the silent type. This guy was very verbose, constantly writing letters to everybody, constantly speaking, coming up with interesting things to say. So debilitated Mercury is questionable if it actually describes his character, because debilitated Mercury typically is interpreted as being at a loss for words, unable to comprehend things, which is what is going to make you scratch your head at how does this guy get to be such a great scientist when his first lord is Mercury and that's debilitated, and his moon is also debilitated. So what Einstein really was quite verbose, and also he was quite socially connected. So it's not exactly like a debilitated Mercury, but he was very cutting and harsh and brutal in how he interacted with people over the long term. So if you look at the tropical chart now, you have Mercury in Aries. With Mercury in Aries, you get a passion for speaking, a passion for thinking, a very individualistic way of thinking and speaking, and a sharp way of thinking and speaking. And in the tropical chart, if you look at the moon, it differs from the sidereal chart in two ways. First of all, it's not debilitated. It's in Sagittarius. See, the tropical ascendant of Cancer might seem a little bit lackluster because, well, he's a genius. Let's give us a Gemini ascendant. He's a genius. But the Gemini ascendant has a debilitated Mercury and a debilitated moon. The Cancer ascendant is not a genius. It's a really withdrawn person. But it's got an Aries Mercury and it's got a moon in Sagittarius, which is very philosophical and smart. Now, that moon in Sagittarius also has a Sunapa Yoga, which is the nice thing to have an exalted planet in the second house. It's got a really great Sunapa Yoga with Mars, which is his yoga karat planet and all kinds of great yogas. So, comparing the two charts, sidereal and tropical, and relating to his autism, the tropical chart really nails it by showing how he's a philosophical thinker that's quite different from everybody else, has a hard time interacting with people, but is very passionate about thinking and speaking, but does it in a really harsh, martial, Marsy kind of way. Now, a siderealist might protest about me pointing out that Mercury is debilitated by saying, look, Mercury has Neech Bhang Yoga, which means the debilitation is modified. So let's talk more about that exalted Venus and if that makes any sense for Einstein when we start looking at his relationships. Maybe an exalted Venus and a debilitated Mercury actually doesn't make any sense at all for Einstein, who was a great scientist but a terrible husband. Okay, now if we move on to look at the Chandra Lagna, Surya Lagna, sidereally what we get for the moon chart, we're going to have the first lord in the third house, which is nice because the third is a house that has a lot to do with intelligence. And it's going to be with Rahu, which is also nice because this person is very unique, different, and this also helps explain autism. So that's the sidereal moon chart is off to a good start with first lord in the third house with Rahu, but it's exalted. So that's kind of a question mark. In this chart, the seventh lord is Venus, exalted in the fifth house. That's a huge question mark in terms of his romantic relationships, in terms of him being autistic. Autistic people have a difficult time interacting with other people. So your seventh lord, which is about how you interact with other people, is exalted in the fifth house, which is about how you communicate to other people. And you're autistic, that's not likely at all. And also this sidereal moon chart has a house exchange with 5 and 4, which is also showing that the emotions can come out and be intellectualized easily, processed easily. So this guy was a great philosophical thinker and mathematician, but he was not an expert processor of emotion. In fact, he was an abject failure at that. could not comprehend other people's emotions. He wrote a letter to his wife when she complained that he was cheating on her. He wrote back to her saying, what's the problem? Let a person do whatever they want to do as long as they're not hurting somebody else. They cannot even comprehend that the reason why she's complaining is because he's hurting her. He's breaking her heart. So his emotional processing is not the type of thing that you would get from a 4th and 5th house exchange in the moon chart. Maybe the 5th and the 4th and the good stuff in the 5th house can show how intelligent he is, but that also affects how his relationships are going. So we have to put a question mark next to that, if that's really a very accurate depiction of this person. Now we switch over to this to look at the sun's chart, sidereal sun-based chart. Here you get the first lord in the 12th house and a 12 house 12 and house 1 house exchange. That's great. Really good depiction of a person that's in a different world from everybody else, on a different page from everybody else, an autistic person. Here you also got the 7th lord debilitated in the 1st house with the 6th lord, 8th lord, and 12th lord. So this is a really good description now here of how he's interacting with people. So sidereal sun-based chart is looking really good. The only problem here is, okay, the 7th lord is debilitated in the 1st house and it's with these negative lords, but all those negative lords are in really good dignity. And Venus here is exalted again in the 1st house. Is that likely a person that has terrible romantic relationships? Now let's take a look at the sun and moon charts from a tropical point of view. The tropical moon base chart, again, you have exactly the same thing with the 1st lord going to the 3rd house with Rahu. So that very accurate thing about here's an intelligent person, a person that likes to write a lot, and a person that's really weird and different, a person that's very motivated and ambitious. We had it in the sidereal chart. We also have it in the tropical chart. Sidereal chart, we had a question mark on why is this lord exalted? That would make good mental health. The 1st lord of the moon's chart is exalted. And here we don't have that. So here we actually get a clearer picture of mental instability because the moon's 1st lord is with Rahu. In the sidereal chart, we had the 7th lord exalted in the 5th house. In the tropical chart, we have the 7th lord in the 5th house again. So we get that stuff about intelligence. But the ability for the intellect to exchange is the 7th lord in the 5th house or the 5th and the 7th. Even more so the 7th and the 5th because the 5th and the 7th tends to get lost and drift. So we have 7th lord coming to the 1st house, but now it's Mercury in Aries, not Venus in Pisces. So it's more about the intelligence of the 7th lord coming to the 5th house because it's Mercury as the 7th lord coming to the 5th house. Then in the sidereal version, it's Venus as the 7th lord coming to the 5th house. So that brings out the love and romance and relationship aspect of those two houses. So here, 7th lord is in the 5th house. I'm sorry if I said 1st before. 7th lord is in the 5th house, Aries, and it's with the debilitated 3rd lord and the 6th lord. So here's a nice description of somebody that's having a hard time communicating, likes to communicate, wants to communicate, but has a hard time doing it. That is an exact picture of Einstein. And if we look at the sun-based tropical chart, here, just like with sidereal, we still have the 1st lord in the 12th house, which is good for describing a person that's in a different world than everybody else on a different page. And this time it's in the 12th house with Rahu. So it's depicting a person that's a bit strange. And also in the sidereal chart, we had a good, accurate 7th lord, the debilitated 7th lord. Here in the tropical sun's chart, we got the 7th lord in Aries with the debilitated 12th lord and 8th lord Venus, and an Aries Venus instead of a exalted Venus. So the sidereal sun-based chart was kind of good, but the tropical sun-based chart is right on. Not just kind of good, but it's right on. Now let's move on, not just for autism and relationships in general. Let's specifically look at the issues about marriage for Einstein. In the sidereal chart, of course, you're going to look at the 7th house, right, for marriage. The 7th lord is Jupiter, and it's in the 9th house. That's a question mark. How is that accurate? that a person with very difficult marriages and very troubled by marriage would have the seventh lord in the ninth house, which would be ethical marriage. Also, in the sidereal chart, you have Venus exalted. Venus is exalted, and it's in a Raja Yoga with the ninth lord. Anybody would interpret that as meaning, well, this is a nice, moral, sound marriage. You can't get more sweet and sound and moral than that. But that's not Einstein at all. So in contrast, look at the tropical chart. Tropical chart has the seventh lord debilitated in Aries. And on top of that, it's with the 12th lord, Mercury. And on top of that, it's got Venus in Aries, which is a real passionate person. And it's Venus in Aries with the debilitated 8th lord and debilitated 7th lord. So it's not a positive kind of passion. So the tropical chart gives a real clear picture of what his actual experience of marriage and romance was, where the sidereal chart gives a really inaccurate picture of it. Now, a siderealist might turn around and say, no, he really does have a exalted Venus. You just forgot the fact that he loved to play violin and he was a great violinist. But look at this sidereal chart. You have Venus with the 8th lord. It's more like, isn't Venus with the 8th lord more directly an implication about the person's sex life than it is about their artistic talents? And also, if you look at his 11th lord sidereally, it's in the 8th house. So is that an indicator of artistic talents, or is that an indicator of a lot of sexual passion? So really what's going on with the sidereal chart is showing really good sex life. 11th lord exalted in the 8th house. And Venus is exalted with the 8th lord. This guy should really enjoy sex, and it shouldn't be a problem in his life. But it was. And he even wrote a letter to somebody, I forget who, saying, you know, what I really admire about your father is that he was able to have one relationship through his whole life with a woman. He said, I failed miserably about that. So then how do you explain this artistic skill that he has with the tropical chart? Combining the 3rd, 5th, 11th, and 4th houses, it makes people incredible musicians. So Einstein has an aspect from the 5th lord, which is Mars, exalted, to the 11th lord, Venus, and to the 3rd house, cusp. And that 11th lord is also the 4th lord. So he's got this artistic yoga also that would make him a great musician. So what you get here on the marriage issue is, wow, the sidereal chart is way off the mark describing his marriage experience. Tropical chart is right on the money. Okay, now if we look at the moon-based and sun-based charts on this topic of marriage, sidereal moon chart, we got the first, remember we had the 1st lord in the 3rd house with Rahu exalted, says the same thing. This makes a person really passionate. That's really great. That is an accurate description of him. He was really into women. But in the sidereal chart, it's exalted, so it should be a positive thing. And again, this one's got the 7th lord as Venus exalted in the 5th house. Does that make any sense for marriage-wise? It's got a 5-4 house exchange. Does that make any sense? Sidereal sun chart, 7th lord debilitated. That explains his marriage really good. But again, that same point. Is this really that awful since it's with an exalted Venus? All kinds of cancellations of debilitations on this. Look in the tropical moon and sun charts. Tropical again has that same thing with the 1st lord in the 3rd house, which is nice, passionate guy, likes sex. And it's not exalted. So it's not necessarily a really good thing for him. And then you have the 7th lord, instead of being exalted in the 5th house, it's just in the Aries in the 5th house. It's a Mercury in Aries in the 5th house, and it's with debilitated Saturn, and it's with the 6th lord. So it's troubling passions. That's a very accurate match. Tropical sun, 7th lord, is in Aries again, with a debilitated 12th lord and an 8th lord. Okay, so now let's talk about his scientific genius. Sidereal chart's got Gemini. We're off to a good start. Gemini ascending. And the sidereal chart's got the 5th lord exalted. So we're off to a great start. Right? It's got Gemini and an exalted 5th lord. 5th is the house of intelligence. And that 5th lord is in a Raja Yoga with the 9th lord. Saturn. And it's in a house exchange, right? There's a 9th and 10th house exchange Raj Yoga too. So it looks like we're in a great space here with this sidereal chart, because we got intelligent sign rising, we got the 5th Lord exalted, and in really, really, really good Raj Yogas. The problem comes though, what about the romantic implications of this? The 5th Lord being exalted also has a romantic implication that doesn't. When it's Venus, the 5th Lord is Venus. It primarily has a romantic implication when it's exalted, but it doesn't match him at all. And why is his Mercury debilitated and his moon debilitated? That makes it difficult to understand. How does a genius have both of the intellectual planets debilitated? Then you can say it's by the cancellation of Mercury's debilitation by Venus. But why does a person who's got a terrible track record with marriage have an exalted Venus? Then you can say, well, that's because an exalted Venus doesn't give good marriage. And that's where I stick you down onto the ropes and say, this is where you went wrong with your astrology, pal. This is where you screwed up your astrology. In order to make it work in your system, you have to deviate from the common sense, logical interpretations of things and make up new ones. Because half the time that you're interpreting Venuses in Pisces, you're really looking at Venus in Aries and you just don't know it. So tropical chart for his genius, you get the 1st Lord as the moon in Sagittarius. So you're also off to a good start. This is what we described before. He was a philosopher. He was using math to try to figure out God, to try to figure out that one underlying principle that is the basis and unifier of everything. So Sagittarius fits his intellect much more than Gemini does. In the tropical chart, we got a 5th Lord exalted too. In the sidereal chart, we had a 5th Lord exalted. We were super happy. In the tropical chart, we don't lose that. We have the 5th Lord exalted and in Raj Yoga because it's doing house exchange with Saturn. So you get a house exchange of 5th and 7th Lords by Saturn and Mars. So forget the romantic implications of that. And so as far as him being a very Jnani type of genius, it's the moon in Sagittarius, and then it's Mars aspecting Ketu in the 2nd house. And actually the Raj Yoga is with the 8th Lord, who's joined to the 12th Lord and the 4th Lord. So it's all of the moksha rulers making house exchange yoga with his 5th house Lord, who is then aspecting Ketu. So it's super Jnani. The tropical chart is showing a super Jnani, philosophical, piercing intellect. Now, finally, let's look at the sun and moon charts in relation to his genius. So again, you got sidereal has got the 1st Lord in the 3rd house exalted for the moon, right? With Rahu. That's great. That's very accurate to who he is. And then it's got an exalted planet in the 5th house, which is great. It explains a very intelligent person. But that exalted planet is Venus. It's confusing. And in that same 5th house is a debilitated Mercury. That's confusing. And we have a 5-4 house exchange, which is good for explaining an intelligent person, but it doesn't really show a logician and a mathematician as much as it shows an intelligent person in communication, comprehension of emotions. The sidereal moon chart does show you a super intelligent person, but does it exactly match Einstein? We have a question mark there. Sidereal sun chart, you got Ketu in the 5th house, which is actually nice because it shows a Jnani. And then you got the 5th Lord in the 9th house, which is also nice because it shows a philosopher. But it's the 5th Lord in the 9th house debilitated, which is a question mark. In the tropical sun and moon charts, you got the 1st Lord in the 3rd house with Rahu, just as you do in the sidereal. Here in the tropical moon chart, you got the 5th Lord exalted again. So in the sidereal chart, we had an exalted planet in the 5th house, but it was Venus, and Mercury was debilitated there. In the tropical moon chart, we have the 5th Lord exalted in the 2nd house, which is the house of knowledge. But in the tropical chart, we do have a debilitated planet still in the 5th house. But it's Saturn. It's with Venus and Mercury. Venus the 11th Lord and Mercury the 7th Lord. So the implication is much more on to his romantic side. That's the weak spot on this Saturn. As far as the debilitation, it gets Neech Panga, just as it does in the sidereal chart, but in the sidereal chart, the Nichbhanga comes from Venus, which doesn't make sense for this person. In the tropical chart, the Nichbhanga comes from Mars, which makes perfect sense for him. And that is actually super great for intellect, house exchange of 5th and 2nd. So the sidereal moon chart is not bad, but this tropical moon chart is bang on. Tropical sun chart, it's got the 5th lord in the 10th house, great. Nothing else really special. To wrap it all up in a summary, the sidereal and the tropical charts, it's not like one is right and one is wrong. As you can see, it's very complicated. Astrology is a very complex thing. The sidereal chart gives you some ballpark, gives you a very nice way of saying, hey, this person's really smart. And it can give you some avenues to see that this person is emotionally troubled, with the moon debilitated in Kemadruma and a debilitated Mercury. But where it really fails is to describe his love life. Whereas the tropical chart is showing a person with exactly the kind of love life that Einstein actually had. And it's describing his genius as something very, very, very otherworldly, Gyani, looking for the mechanisms at the heart of physical realities, and not really in touch at all with emotional realities, not really giving a damn about them. So, did you like it? Or are you just chomping at the bit to explain how it's totally wrong? If you want to explain how it's totally wrong, that's cool. You can make your own videos about it. But you know what I suggest to you is try to learn rather than win. Because what I'm arguing to you is not based on my opinion. Though it is my opinion. The reason why I have this opinion is because it's the opinion of Surya Siddhanta and the Puranas. So give it the benefit of the doubt. Try not to argue with it and try to see the truth in it. But if you don't want to, that's fine. Because, as I said, this video is not setting out to prove anything to anybody, but to just show you how it's done and how it makes sense.